All right, blood vessels is the subject of today's lesson. We talked about the heart yesterday, last time. So let's think about blood vessels. And there's essentially three major types of blood vessels. But we also have, in biology, scientists love to make names for things, right? And so they're constantly making names. If you have something like a cup, they call it a cup. But then if you have a smaller cup, they'll call it something else, like a cupula or something. They'll make another name for a smaller version of it. And so there's lots of these words that we use to describe blood vessels, as we'll see. But the basic three are the arteries. So let's talk about arteries first. We'll do them and we'll talk about them all. The other two are, of course, the veins and the capillaries, but we'll deal with those in a minute. Arteries are the blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart towards the body or the lungs or the places where it's going. So let's write that down. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Because remember, the heart is a big pump. It's like a cycle. So there's blood going away, and then from the left ventricle or from the right ventricle. That's also going away from the heart on its way to the lungs, right? The right ventricle goes to the lungs, left ventricle pumps to the body. But they're both pumping away, carry blood away from the heart. Now that means that most of the arteries in your body are carrying oxygenated blood that's already gone to the lungs and is being sent on its way to the rest of the body. But there are a couple of arteries. There are some arteries that do not carry oxygenated blood. Those are the arteries going to the lungs from the right ventricle. They're still arteries because they're going away from the heart. But that blood is being sent to the lungs for oxygenation. So the pulmonary arteries don't carry oxygenated blood. So sometimes people use that as their delineation. They'll say, oh, arteries carry oxygenated blood and veins carry deoxygenated blood. And that's true most of the time, but we have to remember those pulmonary arteries, they are carrying deoxygenated blood. So I'm not even going to write that down. If you're coming away from the heart, we can kind of figure that out ourselves, okay? Arteries, if we draw sort of a cross-section of an artery, like this, what we'll find is the artery has a very thick muscular wall. Let me get a crayon and we'll shade this in. A very thick muscular wall. And that's because when the blood pumps, when the heart pumps, the blood is coming out of the heart with quite a bit of pressure. Right? We know we have blood pressure. We measure our blood pressure. We'll talk about that later. But this pressure has to be held. If you use a garden hose, when you turn it on, water puts pressure on the hose. If the hose is made of a very thin material, the pressure will break the hose, right? So arteries, because they're coming from that powerful left ventricle or the right ventricle, they're full of blood that is under a great deal of pressure. So arteries are designed for high pressure blood. So let's put over here some little notes. High pressure. They have thick muscular walls. These are made of smooth muscle, by the way. Thick muscle walls. Maybe you want to write in there to remind yourself a little star and write smooth muscle, because that's a particular kind of tissue that we studied, right? Muscular tissue. Skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle. These are smooth muscles. And of course, these muscles can be controlled by your body. So your body can send signals to these muscles and cause them to squeeze. If you squeeze these muscles, then what happens is the artery it sort of squeezes in and makes the pressure higher. And if you relax it, it makes the pressure lower. So by squeezing and relaxing these muscles, we can change the blood pressure in our vein, or in our arteries. And we can also change the way blood flows. We can redirect blood by squeezing arteries more. you can have less blood inside of them, right? Squeezing the blood to other places. Like when you're stressed, your body will secrete hormones that cause the vessels to constrict in your arms and legs and sort of keep the blood moving towards your stomach. I think we talked about that the other day. Okay, so that's how the arteries work. Of course, the most famous artery is the aorta, but then the aorta branches into smaller arteries, and these arteries all have names. Biologists name them all. There's the brachial artery, there's the hepatic artery, there's the renal artery, and they all have names depending on where they go and what they carry blood to. We're not going to learn them all. We're just going to, if they come up, we'll talk about them, but we're not going to learn about them all. So that's the main thing we should mention about arteries. Veins are the other type of blood vessels. Veins usually carry blood back to the heart. Carry blood back to the heart. And so that often means they're carrying blood with less oxygen because it's already been used by the body, right? The cells have already extracted the oxygen they need, and the blood is now on its way back to get a refill. So most veins are coming back into the heart through the big superior and inferior vena cava. Remember the big blood vessel that comes from the top and the bottom, and they empty into the right atrium. But, of course, there's a couple veins that come back to the heart with oxygen in them, and those are the pulmonary veins. So the pulmonary arteries and the pulmonary veins are the exceptions to this little rule about where the oxygen is. Okay? So these carry blood back to the heart. But incidentally, we often use the color red to describe oxygenated blood vessels. We draw them in red, and we often use blue for veins. So arteries are red and veins are blue for the most part, but a good biologist has to remember those small exceptions. When you do dissections of animals, we often inject dyes into their bloodstream, right? Into the veins and arteries. The blood is actually drained out. And we inject dyes inside, so when you cut them open, the arteries are actually dyed red, and you can see them better. And then the veins are actually dyed blue, so you can see them better. In real life, they're not red or blue. They're kind of a grayish beige color. They're just like tissue. But we dye them in things that we dissect sometimes to help us see them better. So red and blue are often used for those reasons. Now, veins are a little bit different. A vein, so I'll draw the vein in blue. The vein also has a muscular wall, but it's much thinner. There's our vein. Let's color in the muscular wall, but it's much thinner. And the reason for that is because the pressure in the vein is not so high. You might wonder why, and we won't know fully why until we talk about the next blood vessel and how they're all interconnected. But for now, we'll just write that down, the lower pressure. So lower blood pressure in veins. Okay, thinner walls. Thinner walls. And veins also have something else really cool. Inside the veins, there are valves. So let's say that the blood in this vein is on its way back to the heart, and it's supposed to be going this way. So what happens is there are these little sort of flaps. Now, it's hard to draw them in 2D, but we'll draw them something like this. And you can imagine that if blood is trying to go this way, it would sort of push the flaps open, and the blood would go through. But if blood tries to go backwards, let me draw another little picture to show that. If blood tries to go backwards through the vein, so let's say the blood is sort of trying to go this way, then it would push these valves sort of out, and they would close off like this and stop the blood from going backwards. So veins have these valves for one-way blood flow. Arteries don't. Arteries don't need a valve because the tremendous pressure of the ventricles contracting pushes the blood in one way. And there's a pretty strong pressure there, so blood doesn't really go backwards. It would be like trying to swim backwards through a river with a very strong current. But in the veins, the pressure is much lower. So you could say it's like a river with hardly any current. So it's easier for the blood to slosh back and forth. And so the veins need a way to keep the blood going the right way. So the veins have valves to control blood flow. Blood can only flow one way in the veins. And I can show you this. It's going to be gross. So I'm going to pause the video. So we're back. There's our veins with the valves inside. Now, sometimes what happens is the valves get weak. So here's something that can happen to people, and it tends to happen to women more than men. It could be a genetic thing or whatever. But when you have, let's put a little girl here, right? And let's just draw her body really badly, grade 3 drawing, right? Isn't that awesome, pick drawing? So down here in her ankles and lower legs, let's just take this over here and blow it up. What's happening is blood vessels, right, are in her legs like this, veins. There's some veins going into her leg. Whoops, I shouldn't have crossed that thing or keep that open. Let's draw some veins here. Now there's supposed to be valves in these veins. The blood is supposed to be going up towards the heart, this way, right? And if it does try to go back down, what's supposed to happen is the valves are supposed to close to keep the blood from flowing backwards. But as the valves get weak over time, and so what happens is the valves begin to fail, and the blood begins to sort of pool in the blood vessels. And that causes the blood vessels to swell up, and they start to get really thick and kind of ugly looking. This is called varicose veins, right? Old people tend to have on their ankles and lower legs big bulgy veins, and that's because the valves are failing and the blood is pooling in their feet. Yeah, it's not super dangerous. I mean, there's still enough blood moving through the body, but this does happen. And one of the ways you can avoid this is by not standing all the time. Humans have this problem. Standing up on two legs it actually solves a lot of problems, frees up our hands, makes us able to build bridges and societies, and so we're not just swinging through the trees eating our own poop or whatever. But we're more sophisticated, but it comes with a lot of biological drawbacks. One of them is pumping blood. Think about a dog. Its heart is pumping more sideways than up and down, right? Because of its body position. So for humans, this up and down position means we've got to pump upwards a lot. And so our legs tend to get this pooling effect from gravity. Also, what helps the blood move up your legs is muscle contractions. When the muscles in your leg contract, they push and squeeze on the veins and help the blood squirt back up. So guess what? Varicose veins can be prevented or minimized by exercise. So what happens with humans is we get really lazy. We work in a job where we stand up a lot on our feet, We're a waitress, or we're working a teacher, standing all day. You're a policeman or a policewoman out on the street walking, and you're not getting as much exercise. And therefore, we see this varicose vein problem. Oh, and high heel shoes. High heel shoes put your body into a very weird position that it's not designed for. So you're essentially walking on your toes all the time. Well, what that does is it changes the muscles you're using to walk and to stand, right? And so if you're always tiptoeing around on your high heel shoes, then your muscles aren't working as well. And it's been shown that high heel shoes a lot, if you work in a workplace where you're always wearing high heels, varicose veins could be a problem in your future. So girls can anticipate this when they're young and stay fit, exercise. Try not to stand all the time. Try to sit and move. Your body's designed to sit down sometimes, move sometimes, stand up sometimes, right? Variation. Everything in variation. Okay, so that's veins. Now let's move on to capillaries. Capillaries. You will sometimes, whoops, let me go back to black. You'll sometimes hear people say this as capillaries. But if you know anything about the English language, I don't know if you know anything about the English language, but a double consonant like this, two L's, there's a reason for it. Did you know that? And the reason is because it's supposed to show you where the stress on a word is. So the stress goes on the syllable just before the double consonant. So capillaries, right? Capillaries. Not capillaries. Capillaries would have to be spelled like this. Whoops, capillaries. No, it's an E, sorry, capillaries. It would have to be spelled like this. Capillaries. But it's not spelled that way. But people pronounce things in weird ways, and part of it also has to do with accents. Capillaries. Capillaries. So, in order to understand capillaries, what we're going to do is we're going to draw a picture that shows you sort of the whole organization of how the blood system works. Because you might be wondering, how does the blood get from an artery into a vein? And in the process, how does it give its nutrients and oxygen and things to cells? So what we have to understand is the whole process. So let me draw another picture. I'm going to have a big artery here. And then this artery is going to start to branch off into smaller arteries, right, like this. And eventually it'll branch off something like this into smaller and smaller branches, right? Let's draw a little bit of branching here. Branch, 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 branch. All right? And then it's going to get smaller and smaller. So now I'm going to change the thickness of the pen because these are going to become an incredibly small network of blood vessels. These blood vessels get so small. Now, of course, I'm drawing this in one picture, right? So it's possible that these could be a little bit longer. So you can kind of do it random. Just kind of do something like that, which shows all the branching of these blood vessels. These blood vessels here are so small, they're about one blood cell thick. Only one blood cell at a time can wiggle through them, which means they're almost microscopic, right? And these are called capillaries. Now what happens is each of these little capillaries is going to slowly, oops, sorry, I got to get a smaller pen here. Now I'm going to change it to blue, and I'm going to take each of these things, and I'm going to kind of draw the picture backwards. But to draw it backwards, it's easier if I start on this side and do the same kind of thing. I go over here, and then I draw the branches like this. Right? Branch, branch, branch. And then eventually, these branches, actually I went a little bit, I could have gone a little bit further, but that's okay. Just wait a minute. Okay, so I managed to figure out how to move that picture over a bit, and it's a little closer. So what you want to do is you want to connect each of these little red guys that you left kind of hanging needs to be connected to a blue guy somehow that branches into like this, right? Branch it in, connect them all, connect. These are going to get smaller and smaller, smaller branches, something like that. I feel kind of like this is like a Bob Ross video sometimes. Wherever you want, you can make your arteries and veins go any way you want. So we get this little blobby thing right here, okay? It's a huge little tangle of tiny, tiny blood vessels. And what we call it is a capillary. It's essentially the capillaries. So this part is called the capillary. I think it has an A. Yeah, it's an A, not an E. I keep writing that. I did it up here too. Capillary. Okay, so it's only my old brain. It is an E, capillary. So for some reason, I had one of those mental blocks where I couldn't remember how to spell anything. Capillary with an E. It's an A. Now you're telling me it's an A. Oh, you guys are screwing me up. What good is Google if it tells you that both things at the same time? All right, so we're gonna go back and correct that again. It is an A, capillary. Wow. Funny how that works, eh? The brain, where you just can't. I could look at that 1,000 times and not be able to tell. So capillary. So we call this a capillary network, or a capillary bed, or a capillary tangle, or the second word isn't really critical. It just describes a whole bunch of them together. A capillary network. Now, over here on this side, we have sort of smaller versions of the artery. So this guy over here is the artery, right? That comes in from the heart. And over here we have the vein. But we have these sort of in-between smaller versions as they branch off. So we give them a special name. Little branchy veins that get smaller are called venules. And little branchy arteries that get smaller are called arterioles. So that just means smaller versions. Remember I told you how we like to create names for things. And then this capillary network in between. Now, the capillary network is so small, remember, it's almost microscopic. At least each of the capillaries is. The whole network could be seen. It's big enough to see. But each of these veins is so small, we're basically talking about one red blood cell thick. Right? So if I were to zoom in on this little section right here, what I would see there is I would see the capillary like this, with a red blood cell sort of moving through it like this. Red blood cells, they don't have a nucleus, but they have a dent. So I'm trying to show the dent in them. And nearby, the tissue would be so small, like this would be one cell, there would be another cell, and another cell. So we've sort of gotten to the level, the cellular size level, by branching and branching and branching. So these capillaries are basically all next to individual cells, right? That's how small they are. And in fact, I didn't do my picture justice. In fact, maybe if I did it better, let's do that blow up a little better. The actual walls of the capillary are made of cells. So the capillary itself would be these long cells making up the wall of the capillary, and there might be a few of them like this, but they're very thin. And here's the other side of the capillary, and we can see the actual cells that are making that wall, right? That blood vessel. And then inside we have these red blood cells, which are sort of these big, they look like a donut, but instead of a hole, they have a dent. We'll talk about those later. And they're basically just small enough to fit through. And then next to the capillary are cells of tissues that the capillary is flowing through. And so at this point, it's very easy for nutrients. Oxygen, for instance, is attached to the red blood cells. Here's my oxygen attached. The oxygen can now diffuse right through the membranes of the capillary wall of the cells and diffuse right into the tissues nearby. So we now are relying on diffusion, very much like a single cell did, right? Relying on diffusion to bring oxygen from the blood into the nearby cells, or other molecules like sugars and nutrients. Now, sometimes it's not just diffusion. Sometimes it's an active or passive kind of transport that's also working. But nonetheless, the point is we can transport or move molecules right into nearby cells because that's how small these capillaries actually are. So the blood itself never really leaves the capillary. Remember, it's a closed system, right? It doesn't bathe the cell tissues, the black cells. The blood stays in the bloodstream, but the stuff that's in it, because of the tiny capillaries, can diffuse or transport itself across those membranes and into the nearby cells. Question? So this is the capillaries. So this is a blow-up of this little circle that I drew right here. It's that little tiny, tiny blue blood vessel called a capillary. Right? And that's what it would look like sort of under a microscope. Now, if we go back to this picture then, what's inside this capillary bed, which I can't really draw without messing this up, but maybe if I took a crayon and maybe I took some gray color here, there would be all kinds of tissue sort of in here that this capillary bed is sort of wrapped around. Right? These are all tissue cells nearby that the capillaries are feeding. They're supplying nutrients and oxygen and taking waste from. So the capillary network is the interchange. It's where you get on and off the bus. Remember we said that the circulatory system is like the bus route? This is how you get on and off. So capillary networks are everywhere in our body. So much so that every single cell we have is connected to a capillary somehow. So it can be fed by the blood. Every single cell. Right? Every single cell. So when you look at your hand, that's why if you cut your skin, even a tiny cut, blood comes out. Because there are microscopically small capillaries everywhere throughout all your tissues. Some of the important parts, of course, are the important connections. Think about this. In your lungs, let's just talk about some of the ways that capillaries work, or where we find very important capillary beds. In your lungs, here are your lungs, and this is the bronchial, actually there's two tubes there. We draw it right. This is just the lung tissue, right? So your lungs kind of have these two, like this. Well, if you look at the lungs under a microscope, if I take a tiny piece of lung and I expand it under a microscope, what I would see is the lung itself is basically a tree of tubes that get smaller and smaller and smaller. It's your throat, your trachea, right, which branches into your bronchi. When you get bronchitis, it's irritation of the tubes lower in your throat. And then bronchioles, and then into these tiny, it just keeps branching smaller and smaller. So if I blew it up, the smallest branch of the lung would open up like this into a little ball. It's called an alveolus. This ball is so small because it's the very end of the smallest branch that what happens is an artery will come by, right? Actually, not even an artery, but an arteriole, and it will branch into a capillary network that is all around this little something like that, all around this little alveolus. And so what that means is that when you fill this with oxygen, when you breathe in fresh air, this is so small that the oxygen can then diffuse right through the cells that make up these tissues and into the blood, right? Or out of the blood. So this would be blood flowing this way through the lungs. As this comes in, the oxygen is now feeding the blood. It's going through the cells by diffusion, through the membranes and into the bloodstream and attaching to the red blood cells. And of course, CO2 is coming out. Carbon dioxide is by diffusion coming out of the blood. So the capillary network is what connects the lungs to the circulatory system. If we look at the intestine, in your body, you have your stomach, your tube comes down, here's your stomach, and then your stomach turns into this long, windy intestine, right? Your small intestine, which then turns into your colon, which then wraps sort of around like this and goes down and out. There's a really bad picture of your intestines. If you take a microscope and you look at what's happening right on the edge of an intestine, what you'll see is the intestine is a tube. It has walls like this. And it actually has little finger-like projections. So the cells of the intestine look something like this. And these little projections, there's one side of the intestinal wall, and here's the other side of the intestinal wall over here. And it's all cells that make these projections called villi, which increase the surface area of the intestine. And then if you were to expand one of these little areas here, what you'd find is that the cells of that villi are surrounded by capillary networks, like this. And the capillaries, right? There's your capillaries. So the blood flows towards your intestines, and it branches and branches and branches, and all around your intestines are these capillary networks that are just waiting to absorb by diffusion mostly, and sometimes transport things we need from our food that we've eaten. So when you get down to the cellular level, everywhere that the bloodstream connects is through a capillary network. And that's how this stuff gets in and out of the blood. So our digestive system is one place where that's critically important, and of course our lungs are another. But anywhere in the body, in the kidney, which filters the blood, there are capillary networks in your kidney. When you learn all about this in grade 12 bio, by the way, so I won't get into all the details, but you get the idea, right? So the capillary network is sort of the interface for the circulatory system to be attached to or to interact with all the other systems and cells in our body. Okay, so that's how capillaries work. Veins, venules, there's sort of the overall picture there. All right, so those are the blood vessels. So we've done the heart and we've done the blood vessels. So our next video, we'll start talking about blood itself.